Got straight to the news, like all the bits. Sick of this basic business. London Unite, stand up in the pits. I'm done with the boring news, watch this.
Here we are at the Greenwich Diversity Conference 2018, where people from all walks of life will be sharing their experiences of how it feels living in a multiracial society and all its day-to-day challenges.
Firstly, we'd like to say thank you all for coming today. We have a great programme coming up for you with guest speakers, as well as the Greenwich and Woolwich MP Matthew Pennycook. Many of us may not be aware of how diversity affects us all on a daily basis. From the food we eat to the clothes we wear, diversity is in hospitals and transportation. It's become a way of life and a true sense of what it means to be British in 2018. Today, we are all here to celebrate diversity and giving everyone a chance to say what it means to us on a personal basis. So without further ado, I'll kick off the celebrations by asking the first person on our programme, actually, not on the programme actually, but Ivis, Councillor Ivis Williams. I'd like to introduce her to the stage.
To thank you all for being here. Just want to say thanks again to Mary. Sorry if you can't hear me, I will shout. I'm not good with the technology. I just want to thank Mary again for playing so skillfully. She did brilliantly. I just want to thank you for your patience, for bearing with us. You know, it's sunny outside. We were expecting a full house, but nevertheless, we're already here. So I just want to say I'm one of the local councillors within Greenwich, and I'm also one of the organisers for putting this event here today. I want to welcome you to this Black History Month Diversity Conference 2018. This special event was organised by the Greenwich Diversity Groups. This group's purpose is to bring together diverse communities, individuals, and to deliver a rich program which aims to encourage, embrace, and celebrate people from Black, Asian, and ethnic minority backgrounds. As we mark Black History Month, we should not forget the effect that historic issues such as slavery has left behind. Not just its abolition, but also the role that Britain and other countries played in the transatlantic slave trade and the repercussion of slavery. The impact of these issues are not minor moments that we should forget. The Caribbean countries are still wrestling with the plantation economics of the past, and that has forced people like myself who has come here and people from the Caribbean that came here and made the journey from 1948 for a better life. We cannot face global challenges appropriately without understanding how they were caused. With Brexit itching closer, we should understand our historic relationships with other nations. History doesn't cease because we have been told to turn the page. By us engaging with our past, only then will we see ourselves truly as we are, which is a multinational nation that overcame slavery. We won 2 world wars, and we won even a World Cup. We still have a long way to go in fighting inequalities. So let's all move forward together, face inequalities and racism with honesty and acknowledging the heroes and the horrors of our shared past. I know today will be a success, so before I start, I just want to thank our very diverse team who has been very well in organising this event today. Just want to say well done, you're all amazing. The purpose of this conference is to celebrate our communities, our rich culture, history of immigration, and to raise awareness of and to open a discourse of issues affecting our communities with major focus on challenges and achievements within our community. Today's conference structure, there'll be a slight change to the structure because our speaker, Matthew Pennycook, our MP, he'll be speaking first.
Thank you, Ivis, also for setting the scene. Ivis is we've got some fantastic councillors who've been on the council for many, many years, but we have a really incredible crop of new councillors who joined earlier last year. May. And Ivis is one of them, and it's great to see that sort of vibrancy being injected into the council to refresh it. So thank you, Ivis, for coming on board. And to each and every one of you for taking the time to not only attend today, but to come and show your support for this event. And I think this is an important event. I hope it can be the first of many to come. I don't think there's ever any need to justify the decision to organise a conference celebrating our diversity, the central role that migration has played in the shaping of who we all are, and the many challenges that minority communities, old and new, still confront on a daily basis. It's always justified to talk about these things. But in my view, it's not only important that we talk about the challenges that minority communities face, and I understand that many of the other speakers will be touching on those issues in their contributions, but I also think, as well as talking about that, as well as talking about the increasingly harsh immigration system we run in this country, we need to confront and talk about the deeper inconsistencies that lie at the heart, I would argue, of our collective sentiments as a country towards migrants and refugees. We are, indeed, we've always been a country of migrants, a migrant nation. There's a writer, Robert Winder, who I like, who put it this way: we're all immigrants, it simply depends how far back you go. And I think that's right. Yet as a nation, or more accurately, a kingdom of nations, there's an uneasy incongruence, I'd argue, in our attitude towards migrants and refugees. On the one hand, as a country, we take pride in a passionate and proud tradition of Britain as a haven for the unfortunate stranger, for the vulnerable, whether they be French Huguenots in the 16th century or the Jewish children that arrived on the Kindertransport in 1939 and 40 as the clouds of war gathered over Europe. On the other hand, there remains a strong belief among a significant section of the population that our national identity cannot accommodate ethnic diversity. And the result is that while few Britons would feel uncomfortable celebrating the contribution of established minority communities, few are equally willing to accept the reality that most of those communities, at least initially, were met with grudging hospitality, if not outright intimidation and often violence. And similarly, and Ivis touched upon this point earlier when she was talking about the history of slavery, few are willing to engage, I think, with the difficult issues around race, inequality and empire that are an integral part of our island story, or to trouble themselves with the fact that our immigration system is having a detrimental impact on hundreds of thousands of people who live here on a daily basis. And there's no better time to talk about these issues than Black History Month, an event which, as well as expanding our knowledge of Black Britons, celebrating tales of anti-racism, and connecting contemporary struggles with those of older generations, has always been, at its core, about providing a space to open new conversations. And that, I think, is what this conference is in the tradition of. I've been asked today to talk about the immigration system and to touch, if I can, upon what that system should look like after we have exited the European Union in March next year. And if you ever switch on Question Time, any questions, any current affairs programme, I think there's a decent chance that after not long you'll hear one of the audience members say that we don't discuss immigration enough. This is a refrain I always hear: we don't discuss it enough. And I don't know about you, but I sometimes feel that we talk about little else in this country other than immigration and now Brexit. The trouble is that the conversation has rarely been an open one, it's rarely been an honest one, it's rarely been a well-informed one. And yet, in spite of all of the negative media coverage of the issue, the public discourse around immigration, particularly throughout and after the Brexit referendum, public sentiment about immigration has changed in recent years in positive ways. Rising numbers accept that immigration is good for the country. The vast majority believe that it's essential, but that economic need should determine its level. And the proportion of people whose hostility to immigration is grounded simply in an outright hostility to other ethnicities or religions continues to fall. That's not to argue that there aren't significant problems, just to highlight that there are many positives about what has happened over even the last 5, but 10, 15 years. The negatives are serious though. Islamophobia is on the rise, reported hate crimes spiked in the wake of the Brexit referendum, and the nature of anti-Semitism continues to evolve, both on the left and the right of British politics. But overall, we've become a more, not less tolerant place in recent years. And yet what's striking, despite that progressive shift in attitudes towards migrants and latent public support for an immigration policy that's pragmatic, that's based on evidence and the economic needs of the country, government policy has become increasingly harsh, and I would argue designed to appeal directly to the prejudices of the minority of Britons who hold unashamedly xenophobic views. Because what else can explain this government's commitment in the face of all evidence to an arbitrary target to reduce migration to the tens of thousands? What else can explain the fact that we're the only country in Europe that continues to make use of indefinite detention? And what else can explain the deliberate decision taken by our Prime Minister when she was Home Secretary to turn Britain into a hostile environment for illegal migrants so that they would be forced to leave? And I want to explore that hostile environment policy in a little more detail. What many people will not necessarily know, I think, is that the policy has largely failed in its stated aim of forcing illegal migrants to leave the country. Few have done so. Instead, what has happened is that many have simply been driven into the shadow economy, or underground, or vulnerable to trafficking and modern slavery. But what we will all know, and we'll all know it because The Guardian exposed the suffering of the Windrush generation for all to see, is that that hostile environment policy has ensnared people beyond those that it was intended to ensnare, those who are legally resident in the country. And the stories of suffering endured by the Windrush generation have been heartbreaking. But this was a story, and I want to make really clear, that MPs were aware of long before The Guardian broke it, and that we had been trying to get a hearing for a long time before Amelia Gentleman broke the story. But the government wouldn't engage. I remember raising a case in early 2017 of a Windrush constituent, and I don't think she'd mind me sharing her story with you today. Elaine lives in Woolwich. Her son, ironically, when we come to talk about contribution, her son served in the military with distinction. She's a lady in her late 50s. She had arrived from Jamaica on her mother's passport as a child. As a result of the hostile environment policy, of the ever-tightening restrictions around immigration, she was asked by her employer, Greenwich University, to provide documentation to prove her legal status. Having never needed such documentation before, she struggled and she eventually lost her job. She then had to go through the process of applying for indefinite leave to remain, which she obtained, but she subsequently failed the Life in the UK test. It was only after the Windrush scandal, having raised her case multiple times at the highest levels of government, that I was able to help secure her passport. And while her status is now secure, nothing, not even the compensation that I'm determined she secures and that others need, can undo the trauma of what she experienced over those years. And as we know, she's one of thousands of British citizens who arrived here after the Second World War, were invited to come to rebuild the welfare state, who have faced homelessness, destitution, detention, been denied NHS treatment, or lost their jobs because of this policy. And tragically, 3 have now died before they were able to make an appeal. And I had 2 in my advice surgery just before coming here. So let's accept the government's narrative that the task force has been set up, that this is all done and dusted, and a minor administrative problem has been dealt with. But Windrush, and this is what I want to come on to, Windrush has left me feeling not only angry, but a little uneasy. And I think this speaks to the point that I started my remarks with about the incongruence in our attitudes towards migrants and refugees, because I'm worried about the fact that the anger around Windrush is, and has been, and will continue to be, I think, selective. And what do I mean by that? I mean that there's a sense from the way the media has reacted to this particular scandal that the wider British public have been permitted to sympathise with this group, and they are deserving of sympathy, because they are established migrants that we can relate to. And the stories have been told that allow us to relate to their experiences. And what I can't shake, and I hope this comes out in the conversation today, is the feeling that the same response would have not been evoked for a different type of immigration policy victim. And that's important because there are many other victims of our immigration policy, and most will fall outside what I can only term that sweet spot where public sympathy is allowed to be poured out in a legitimate setting or a mainstream setting. And I think that stems from the fact that we're only allowed to sympathise for moments if we are given those signals that they are relatable, they're acceptable, they're people with hopes and fears, dreams, aspirations like us. But lots of the victims of the current system don't get that hearing. And I make that point because I really want to get across that Windrush is not an aberration. This is not a simple error, an administrative oversight, an unattended consequence. And the problem did not begin in 2010. And I, for one, have never shied away from criticising the last Labour government and defending what it did right. But this is a policy that had its genesis in the years before. But it really started in 2010. And the official documents are there, and they prove that it is. And it's an immigration policy that's been in place that's driven by ideology, and it's designed to reject and eject as many people from the UK as possible, regardless of extenuating circumstances or status. As the Prime Minister herself put it in 2013 when taking the immigration bill through Parliament, it's a system based on the logic of deport first and appeal later. And that is what led us to Windrush. And it's a policy that has seeped out into society as a whole. It obliges doctors, landlords and bank staff to effectively become border policemen. And the impact is tangible, even locally, and councillors here will know this. I regularly come across instances of landlords less willing to rent to people with foreign accents, foreign names, for fear of getting the paperwork wrong, or more maliciously, of local letting agents, and there are one that comes to mind which is very sizable, that covertly screens applicants from migrant communities. They would never say so directly, but there are tests in these applications that screen people from certain ethnic minority communities locally from even reaching the stage where they can rent a house. And that is happening here today and now. That's why we need to see an end to the hostile environment policy. And I mean an end. Shifting the rhetoric simply from hostile to a compliant environment, as Sajid Javid did, is meaningless if it's simply a rebranding exercise that leaves the fundamentals of the policy in place. But beyond that, and here's what I kind of want to bring my remarks to a close, I think we need a root and branch reform of the immigration system as a whole. Whether it's a rethink of the callous clampdown on spousal visas that has left thousands of children living without one of their parents, a review into the ever-tightening restrictions on visitor visas, and I've had huge numbers of these cases over the last 2 or 3 months, that are stopping parents, family members from attending weddings, funerals, first birthdays, or whether it's reform of the unreasonably high income visa requirements that are separating British subjects from their families. And the Home Office bureaucracy as well needs to be overhauled. The councillors in the room will know, but those of you who've come to my surgery, even ever talked to me about the casework load I have to deal with, will know that my small team of caseworkers deals with hundreds, and I mean hundreds, of immigration cases each and every week. And I see in my surgeries the anxiety and distress that it causes, that the failings of that system cause local people. It is a government that I would argue is almost unique in its ability to combine deliberate obstructiveness when dealing with people's cases, but also an awesome inability to even administer its own basic systems or its rules. When almost half of all immigration and asylum decisions that go to appeal in England and Wales are overturned, we know that the system is flawed and it's failing. And I genuinely fear, and this I think where Brexit comes into it, that this will only get worse as the government is forced in a very short space of time to overhaul the entire immigration system, and on top of everything else manage the complexity of a EU settlement scheme that potentially encompasses more than 2 million citizens of this country as they are processed under the new arrangements. And anyone in this room, and there may well be, I had a distinct impression throughout the referendum when speaking to voters, I use this in a very general sense, but voters from our ethnic minority communities locally, that while they told me they were going to vote for Remain, that they were actually going to vote Leave. I'll never be able to prove it, they were too polite for me to say it, but lots were taken in by the lie that Commonwealth citizens would be prioritised, that Commonwealth citizens would better get a deal once we were out of the European Union and EU nationals no longer had any preferential treatment. I don't think that will be the case because of the deal we strike with the EU. But even if it was, I think the Home Office bureaucracy will fall over in a way that makes the treatment of Commonwealth citizens worse, if not as bad as it's been over recent years. And so I'm afraid those people are at least going to be sorely disappointed. So I'll finish on this. What needs to change? In my mind, we need to focus on three things. Simplifying the system, making it more transparent and accountable, and ensuring that when it's overhauled, as it must be, it's rebuilt on different foundations, different values. I just want to touch very briefly on all of those. First, simplification. We've had 11 immigration acts over the past 50 years and thousands upon thousands of regulations passed through Parliament. The system is a bureaucratic maze, and it basically forces applicants now. This is why, in many cases, my team and myself are unable to help them. It basically forces you to secure costly legal assistance to even make an application now, let alone appeal one. And particularly in light of the cuts to legal aid, we need a system which people can navigate easily, and it has to be a system that works for individuals and the economy as a whole. No one is served by arbitrary income thresholds for jobs or on family reunion. Second, transparency and accountability. If we continue to operate a system that perpetrates as many errors as the current one does, often grave errors, the system will continue to not enjoy public confidence. And we need a system that enjoys public confidence for applicants and for the wider society. We need one that deals with applications in a timely manner, by qualified and trained professionals with a time to look at the merits of each individual case. When the Home Office advisors who came to the Joint Committee on Human Rights in Parliament gave their testimony, and it's interesting to go and read it, look how much time they had to deal with one of these cases. These were mid-level civil servants, 5 to 10 minutes to deal with every complex Windrush case. No wonder things weren't checked, no wonder details weren't cross-referenced, no wonder people have suffered as a result. And I know from my postbag that so many, I would say thousands upon thousands of people locally, in Woolwich, in Thamesmead, Plumstead, Abbey Wood, Charlton in particular, are left in limbo for years, and I mean years. I've dealt with cases where people have been waiting 11, 12 years for an outcome without a decision being reached. That not only takes a huge toll on them, and in many cases really affects their mental health, but it does really undermine public confidence in the system. Because many of those individuals, and you can completely understand why, will refuse to go home, even if they have lodged and failed every appeal avenue that they can legally seek redress from, because they've established a life here. So keeping people in limbo for years and years serves no one well. And finally, I just want to talk about the principles that must undermine the system. It's got to be built on civil liberties and a respect for human rights. I could have devoted a whole speech to the way the current system disregards people's human rights. And I think if I had to be pushed on one, perhaps the most egregious example of that is the indefinite detention of young children who are threatened with deportation to countries which they have no connection with and that are completely alien to them. And we're the only country in Europe that operates such a system. The crux of the matter is the current system fails to adequately engage with people as people rather than just numbers, and it fails to look at the complexity of their lives. And despite what many of the extreme Brexiteers would have us believe, we're not going to suddenly be able to stop doing without migration. Any trade deal we strike around the world will include some system of, you won't call it free movement, but it will be easy access to live and work in this country, because that will be the price of any preferential trade deal. And the challenges we're facing as a world, not least a global refugee crisis that has seen 21 million people driven to flight by civil war, persecution, natural catastrophe and poverty, are going to be with us for some time. Ultimately, those international problems need to be solved at source by ending the conflicts, persecution and poverty that have forced people to flee in the first place. And that will require radical solutions, visionary leadership, and an extent of global cooperation that it is hard to see in a world of Trump and the rise of populist dictators around the world us achieving. But at home, we've got more control on what we can do. And if we're to avoid the mistakes of the past 8 years, we're going to need a migration system that's built on different values. Now, I can't pretend Labour has a fully worked up immigration system ready to go, but we know the values that will guide us in getting there. It's got to be a just system that treats people fairly and humanely, and a rational system based on evidence. And that will mean a continued focus on preventing illegal immigration. But what it will also mean, for those legally entitled to be here, will be no more deportations of family members, no exclusion of family members, no minimum income requirement for those seeking to come here to be reunited with their family, no indefinite detention, and no hostile environment, no deport first and appeal later. And I just want to finish on that message. The current system has failed. It's time for a change, and I'm confident that when we are elected to government, we will change that system. Thank you for listening to me.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me here today. I'd like to speak about two issues that Liberty is working on at the moment, namely the hostile environment and ending indefinite immigration detention. Liberty is a human rights organisation that's been fighting for the rights and freedoms of people in the UK since 1934. And we've obviously seen the hostile environment encroach on all our spaces, both within migrant communities and more broadly BME communities. And as these policies have intensified in their implementation, we've seen that this has been touching the lives of people within communities like yours, and it's enabled state actors to make assumptions about people's immigration status based on the colour of their skin. It's reinforcing prejudices that we hoped were long gone. Liberty's Care Don't Share campaign is calling for an end to all hostile environment measures and for a data firewall so that personal information collected by trusted public services will never be shared with the Home Office for immigration enforcement purposes. So to look at this issue and how the hostile environment's affected people's lives, I want to look at four main areas. Firstly, how the hostile environment operates in the NHS. Secondly, how it operates in schools. Thirdly, its encroachment on police operations. And fourthly, immigration detention. So, as was mentioned earlier, many doctors and medical professions have become de facto border guards in our hospitals and in our healthcare services. And this has happened in a number of ways, but namely through a data sharing agreement between NHS Digital and the Home Office, which enables the NHS to share people's personal information that they go to a doctor believing will be confidential with the Home Office, and the Home Office will then refer them for a deportation order. These measures have been proven to have devastating impacts on migrants' health-seeking behaviours. So we've been working closely with our friends at the Migrants' Rights Network, the National AIDS Trust and Doctors of the World on this particular issue. Now, Doctors of the World is a frontline organisation who deal with undocumented migrants and help them with medical issues when they feel that they can't go to the NHS. And I just want to share with you a few examples of stories of what people have endured because of the hostile environment. One man from the Democratic Republic of Congo had been imprisoned and tortured in his country of origin on account of his political beliefs. He presented to a Doctors of the World clinic as suicidal and severely distressed, and he hadn't felt comfortable to access any mental health services or any other medical help through the NHS. He was worried that medical professionals there would notify the Home Office of his whereabouts and that he would be then sent back to his country of origin, where he would be subject to further violence. Now, in another case, a female domestic worker died after refusing to seek treatment for an undiagnosed disease due to the fear that if she approached the NHS, she would be reported to immigration services. She was a victim of abuse, and in one instance, her employer had scalded her with boiling water, but she didn't report the injuries or the incident as she was too afraid to alert the authorities. Ultimately, it was not the abuse that killed her. It was the fact that her disease went untreated because she was too frightened to access healthcare. So in all of these cases, people felt that their only options were to either endure painful, damaging health conditions or to face deportation. And whose lives are at risk? Inevitably, it is BME migrant communities, many of whom who lived in the UK for years. Now, in April 2018, in response to ardent campaigning by Liberty and others, the government announced it would dramatically curtail arrangements to share data between NHS Digital and the Home Office to trace undocumented people. But there is still more work to do, so that no data is shared for immigration purposes. But this huge concession does show that when public servants, campaigners and communities take a stand, we can win. Now, looking at the situation in schools, from 2015, the Home Office and the Department for Education shared school records of up to 1,500 children a month for immigration enforcement purposes. This allowed a child's name and home address to be collected by teachers for the school census. This was then handed to the Home Office so parents could be traced down and potentially deported. The agreement had been operating in secret for over a year before the agreement was exposed for a Freedom of Information request. Now, as a result, many parents inevitably felt that schools were not a safe place for their children. Those extremely fearful of deportation or detention withdrew their children from school entirely. And it goes without saying that this has a detrimental impact on children's futures in an environment where they should be protected and nurtured. Now, in April 2018, the Department for Education decided to end the collection of nationality and country of birth data in schools. An excellent result achieved by a campaign robustly run by Against Borders for Children, Liberty and many others. Our legal team also took the Department for Education to court over this issue to apply further pressure to end this injustice. However, the Department for Education is still sharing the addresses of hundreds of children and families with the Home Office every month. The government also freely admits that it will use the immigration exemption in the Data Protection Bill to help the Home Office access yet more school records for immigration enforcement. We are continuing to fight this battle to ensure schools are a safe place for every child across the country. Now, police operations. Now, this has been a growing area of contention where the hostile environment has been encroaching on police operations, and this is affecting how undocumented people come into contact with authorities. Freedom of Information requests made by journalist Natalie Bloomer and the frontline women's organisation Latin American Women's Rights Service showed that over half of police forces in England and Wales share data of victims of crime to the Home Office. The impact of this has been particularly devastating for migrant and BME women, particularly those subject to domestic violence. Now, in one case reported by Southall Black Sisters, a woman's husband threatened to kill and attempted to strangle her. He then left her stranded. She was supported by Southall Black Sisters to report her experience to the police, but instead of investigating her report, they were more interested in her immigration status. They asked her questions about her status, causing her to panic and become distressed. Officers had to be reminded that their priority was to assist her as a victim of domestic violence and not to police her immigration status. They have still not taken action against the perpetrator. These types of responses to BME and migrant victims of abuse are routine and regular acts of state violence. Women are afraid to report the abuse to the police because they are worried they'll be disbelieved, referred to immigration services, or deported. They are also re-traumatised by these really aggressive interactions with police officers. Now, the number of referrals of victims of crime to the Home Office will not only deter victims from reporting future incidents, but will impact worsening relationships between the police and BME communities. This essentially will lead and has led to a two-tier justice system. In another shocking case in 2017, a woman who was reported being kidnapped and raped was arrested on immigration charges while being cared for at a centre for sexual assault victims. She was 5 months pregnant at the time. This treatment of society's most vulnerable is unacceptable. Compassionate and legitimate policy aims, such as protecting victims of crime, maintaining an accessible public health service, providing homelessness support, and safeguarding children, have become subordinate to the government's immigration enforcement priorities. Now, alongside other women's rights and victims' rights groups, we are calling for an urgent firewall between public services and the Home Office to stop this data sharing. Now, I just quickly want to talk about immigration detention, and it's been touched on before. The detention of migrants in immigration removal centres predates the hostile environment, but it's clear that the hostile environment policy has intensified the number of people and the length of time for which they're being detained. In the year ending June 2018, 26,215 people were subject to this cruel system. It's one of the largest operations of its kind in Europe and the only one without a time limit. Many of these people will never be brought before a court, and a judge will never make a decision to, in fact, detain them. It's been criticised by the UN, it's been criticised by a number of MPs, but it still continues. We know that detention increases people's mental health problems, and the longer they are in detention, the more their mental health problems deteriorate. And we know that most people, the vast majority of people, are being held for more than 28 days. As one person who was detained in Morton Hall says, "We are told the focus of detention is removal, but I don't see the justification for detaining someone for 1 year, 2 years, for 3 years, and you're telling me the purpose is to remove people? This is a country that promotes human rights. They're the first ones to do so. But what would the rest of the world think about this? It's not right." Now, Liberty's calling for an urgent 28-day time limit on immigration detention. And there are lots of ways you can support us to do this. I've brought some campaign packs along with me which will encourage you to organise events in your community to talk about this issue. And there are some on the stalls outside, so please do get one later. So ultimately, it's not just undocumented migrants who are affected by the hostile environment. We've seen over recent months how BME, British citizens, and people with settled status experience the same forms of state violence, including the denial of healthcare, the threat of deportation or detention, and being criminalised by the police even when they are victims of crime. But we can dismantle it. Campaigning groups have had great success in calling out the government's unacceptable actions and encouraging the public to speak up against these wrongs. So if you take one thing away from this, remember that no matter how entrenched a government policy is, there is always a movement for change. Now is an opportune moment to hold the government to account for its discriminatory migration laws and policies, and the subsequent violations of people's human rights that take place every day. So I'd urge you all to join Liberty, join your local campaigning groups, and keep speaking truth to power. Through solidarity and partnership, we can work towards a truly equal, compassionate, and just society for all those in it. Thank you.
How do you feel from listening to what you've heard? What do you think about it?
I think the thing that came over to me was that there's a huge amount going on, and there's some very knowledgeable people out there in the community. Lots of campaigning activity, people have experience of it, and they're able to give very, full reports of the issues that exist across the borough, and the impact and the negative impacts that discrimination, racism is having on people's lives.
I just want to say, to introduce myself, I'm Councillor Ivis Williams I represent the Woolwich Common Ward. I was very much involved in the organisation of this event. I think the event went well. It was good to hear feedback from the community and what residents had to say in terms of how, the frustrations they're facing. So it was, at times, it was challenging because, there were questions which no one in the room was able to answer. But I think what we've taken away is action points, and we'll be doing feedback to make sure that people's, the questions raised were answered.
I think it raised some interesting questions, and clearly what seems to me to be apparent is that we do need to have a forum for discussion and a two-way discussion. I mean, I think that's the sort of outstanding message of today.
And do you think the points that people was making was...
They were absolutely valid, and again, this is about people feeling they haven't had that voice. But for me, also, I think our responsibility is to ensure that our residents know that they do have areas where they can be heard.
Yes.
People can make representations to full council. People can come to scrutiny, and they will be allowed to speak because these are public forums.
Yeah.
Likewise, the CCG governing body, you can go and sit there and make your comments. But we need to make that more.
And do you think we should have more diversity meetings like this?
I think it shouldn't be about Black History Month. I think our experience is not an experience over a month.
Mm-hmm.
It's our lives.
It's a life, yes. It's a life experience, isn't it?
We need to be talking.
It's not supposed to condense it.
No. I think it's Black History Month is a matter of convenience. We need to have these discussions throughout the year.
For me, it's just been a very wonderful privilege to be one of the lead organizers of this diversity conference. And I'm so happy the way the event went, right from the people that we invited, the key speakers, and all the invited guests, they all arrived. And I'm also very happy to see a vast, diverse, community within Greenwich coming together in this kind of event. So yes, I think the event, I'm really very happy the way the event went. obviously this is something that we would like to continue, to organize from time to time, because this is the first time that we organize this diversity conference, and we do believe that there are things that we will learn from this event. But one thing that's stood up for me in this particular event is that you can see that people really need this event, because people want to say something. People just want to make sure that our voices are being heard, and which is something very great. This is why the event is meant for. So this tells us that there's a need for this event, and we want to organize the event again so that people can come. Yes, I know that there are things that we need to learn, there are things we need to put in place properly, so that this event, once we organize it, it's going to be perfect than what this one is. But I want to say, yes, it's a huge success. Yes, people will be invited. They enjoy themselves, the community, they enjoy themselves, and also the key speakers, they give our message there for the borough to see the reason why they need to be very much inclusive in what they do to take diversity into consideration when they are doing anything within the borough. So for me, yes, I think it's a very good event.
After listening to these inspiring and inspirational speakers, we hope this will inspire you to join us at the next Diversity Conference here in Greenwich. I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you to all the organisers for allowing us to take part in such an amazing diversity conference where diversity is the focus.